The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of day where nothing important is supposed to happen. No drama, no turning points, just mail, bills, and silence. I almost didn't open it right away. My father's handwriting had a way of tightening my chest even before I read a single word. Sharp letters, heavy pressure. As if every sentence was meant to leave a mark. At first glance, it looked elegant. Thick paper, cream-colored, formal, too formal for a birthday. My name was written without warmth, without the nickname he used when I was a child and still useful to him. I told myself not to overthink it. I'd spent most of my life doing that, making excuses for him before he even spoke. I opened it while standing in the kitchen. My daughter was at the table behind me, humming softly, coloring something that looked like a family with mismatched heads and crooked smiles. I remember that detail clearly because later, it would hurt more than it should have. The invitation started politely. Date, time, location. My father's milestone birthday, a formal gathering, family only. I was already preparing myself mentally what to wear, how long to stay, how to avoid the usual comments about my life choices. Then my eyes moved to the last line. Heirs only, no dead ends, do not bring your daughter. I read it once, then again. Slower the second time, as if speed had been the problem. It was. The words stayed exactly where they were, heavy and deliberate. There was no confusion, no misunderstanding. This wasn't badly phrased, it was intentional. I felt heat rise to my face, the kind that makes your ears ring. Not because I was shocked deep down, I knew who my father was, but because a part of me had still hoped he wouldn't cross this line. I folded the invitation carefully, too carefully, like if I treated it gently, it might hurt less. Behind me, my daughter asked what I was holding. Her voice was light, curious, normal. She didn't know anything yet. That felt important. Fragile. I told her it was Grandpa's birthday invitation and left it at that. I didn't turn around while saying it. I didn't trust my face. I walked into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. My first instinct was silence. That's what I'd been trained to do. Don't argue. Don't confront. Don't make things uncomfortable, especially not with him. My whole life had been shaped around staying just agreeable enough to remain included. But this wasn't about me. That realization landed quietly and then all at once. This wasn't a comment, or a joke, or one of his outdated opinions I could roll my eyes at later. This was a decision, a declaration. My child had been officially categorized and dismissed. When my husband came home, I handed him the invitation without saying anything. He read it once, then looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, part anger, part disbelief, part something colder. He asked if my father had lost his mind. I told him no. I told him this was probably the clearest he'd ever been. We talked about not going, about cutting contact, about protecting our peace. All reasonable options, all safe. And for a moment, I almost chose them. Almost chose to stay home, to let my father have his gathering exactly the way he wanted. Curated, controlled, sanitized of anything that challenged his worldview. That night, after my daughter was asleep, I went into her room and stood there longer than usual. She was sprawled across the bed, one arm thrown over her head, completely unaware that somewhere, a grown man had reduced her entire existence to a problem. I realized something then, something uncomfortable but undeniable. If I didn't show up, this wouldn't end. It would just quietly continue. My father wasn't expecting a confrontation. He was expecting compliance, absence, silence. He was expecting me to understand my place the way I always had. That's when the decision stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling necessary. I wasn't going to argue with him over the phone. I wasn't going to send a long, emotional message. I wasn't going to beg him to reconsider. I was going to attend. And I was going to bring exactly what he told me not to. Not to cause a scene, not to embarrass him, but because some lines, once crossed, don't allow you to go back to being polite. I placed the invitation back into its envelope and set it on the table. The words didn't sting anymore. They clarified things. And clarity, I was learning, could be its own kind of strength. Growing up, my father was never cruel in loud ways. There were no dramatic outbursts, no scenes that neighbors whispered about. His power lived in tone, in pauses, in the way approval was given sparingly and taken back without explanation. Love in our house was something you earned and could lose. He believed deeply in legacy, not in values or kindness or the kind of legacy that lives in stories people tell when you're gone. His version was simpler and harsher. Names, bloodlines, continuation. From a young age, I understood that my role in this vision was conditional, useful only as long as I could contribute something tangible to it. When I was a child, he praised me for being quiet, for being obedient, for not causing trouble. Those compliments faded as I grew older and more independent. By the time I was an adult, they were replaced with questions disguised as concern. When would I settle down? When would I give him something to be proud of again? Marriage didn't improve things the way I thought it might. My husband was respectful, stable, kind, everything that should have mattered. But my father measured men differently. He assessed usefulness the way someone evaluates an investment. Polite approval, no warmth. Tolerance, not acceptance. Then I got pregnant. I remember telling my father, my voice shaking with a mix of excitement and fear. There was a pause on the other end of the line when I told him the baby was a girl. Just a pause. No congratulations. No disappointment spoken out loud. Silence can carry a lot of meaning when you're used to listening for it. After she was born, things shifted in ways that were easy to ignore if you wanted to. Gifts arrived late or not at all. Visits became shorter. Family photos were taken without urgency, as if her presence was optional. At gatherings, my daughter was treated kindly, but lightly. Like a guest, not blood. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being sensitive. My father was just old-fashioned and would come around. That's what you do when the truth threatens to fracture something you've spent your life trying to preserve. As the years passed, I watched him celebrate other grandchildren with a pride that felt performative. Boys were praised loudly. Their achievements, no matter how small, were broadcast and remembered. My daughter's accomplishments were acknowledged politely, then forgotten. No malice, just indifference. And somehow that hurt more. Still, I stayed. I showed up. I smiled. I managed conversations carefully, like stepping through a room full of fragile glass. Because part of me still wanted his approval, even if I pretended I didn't. Even if I told myself I was doing this for family harmony. The invitation stripped all of that away. It said out loud what had only ever been implied before, that my daughter was not a future, but a conclusion. That I had failed, in his eyes, to produce something worth carrying forward. Once I let myself see it clearly, other memories rearranged themselves. Comments that once felt awkward now felt deliberate. Jokes that landed wrong suddenly made sense. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a worldview. I thought about calling him, about asking him to explain. But I knew how that conversation would go. He would frame it as practicality, tradition, not personal. He would tell me I was overreacting, that I should understand how things work. And somehow I would be the one apologizing by the end. So instead, I said nothing. In the days leading up to the party, I went about my life normally. Work, school drop-offs, dinner, bedtime stories. My daughter practiced a small presentation for school, proudly explaining facts she'd memorized. I listened, smiling, wondering how anyone could look at her and see an ending instead of a beginning. The night before the birthday, she asked what we were doing the next day. I told her we were going to Grandpa's party. She smiled and asked what she should wear. I told her something comfortable, something that made her feel like herself. I didn't tell her anything else, not yet. As I lay awake that night, I felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not fear, not anger, resolve. I wasn't going to go there to fight. I wasn't going to raise my voice or demand anything. I was going to be present, fully, honestly, without shrinking. My father had drawn a line and expected me to stay on my side of it. He never considered that I might step over it calmly, holding my daughter's hand, and let him deal with what that revealed about him. By morning, the plan was simple. We would go. We would stay as long as it felt right, and whatever happened after that would no longer be controlled by silence. The day of the party felt strangely ordinary, which almost made it worse. I woke up early, helped my daughter get dressed, packed a small bag without really knowing why. She chose a simple dress on her own, nothing fancy, nothing loud, just something she liked. I noticed how confident she looked standing in front of the mirror, completely unaware that her presence alone was about to disrupt a carefully controlled room. The drive there was quiet, not heavy, just focused. My husband asked once if I was sure. I nodded. There was no doubt left to entertain. Doubt had already done enough damage in my life. My father's house looked exactly as it always had from the outside. Clean lines, perfectly trimmed hedges, everything in its place. A house designed to impress from a distance and keep people at arm's length once they were inside. Cars lined the driveway when we arrived. Expensive ones, familiar ones, family members who knew the rules and followed them. As soon as we stepped inside, I felt it. That shift in energy you can't explain but instantly recognize. Conversations didn't stop completely, but they slowed. Voices dipped. Eyes moved, then moved again. I held my daughter's hand a little tighter, not to protect her, but to steady myself. My father saw us almost immediately. I knew he would. He always noticed disruptions. His smile froze for a fraction of a second before returning, thinner than before, controlled, practiced. He didn't come over right away. That felt deliberate, like he was deciding how to handle this without losing face. Relatives approached in stages. Some smiled genuinely at my daughter, crouching down to greet her like nothing was wrong. Others barely acknowledged her at all. A few avoided us completely. The pattern was impossible to ignore once you stopped pretending not to see it. My daughter, on the other hand, was calm, curious. She commented on the decorations, the cake, the music. She didn't feel excluded because no one had told her she should be. Children are honest that way. They take the space you give them. Eventually, my father approached. He greeted my husband politely, nodded at me, and then looked at my daughter, not with anger, with calculation. That was the part that chilled me. He leaned down, said hello, asked her how school was. Perfect manners, perfect performance. Then he asked me to step aside. We moved to a corner near the window where the noise of the room softened just enough for his voice to drop. He didn't raise it. He never did. He asked me what I thought I was doing. I told him I was attending his birthday. He reminded me of what the invitation said, as if I might have missed it. I told him I hadn't. He said I'd put him in an impossible position. I said he'd done that himself. He said this wasn't the time or place. I said there never would be a time or place if we waited for his comfort. That was the first crack. I saw it in his eyes before he masked it again. He told me this wasn't personal. That word again. As if intent erased impact. As if calling something tradition made it harmless. He said I should understand. That I always had before. Something in me finally let go. Not dramatically. Quietly. I told him I did understand. I told him I understood exactly how he saw my daughter. I told him I understood that this party wasn't really about his birthday at all. It was about reminding everyone who mattered and who didn't. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate response. Across the room, my daughter was laughing with someone, completely at ease. I watched her for a second, then looked back at my father. I told him I wasn't there to fight. I was there because I refused to teach my child that love was conditional or that her worth depended on someone else's definition of legacy. He looked around the room, then back at me. I could see him recalculating, wondering who might be listening, wondering how this would look if it went any further. He told me we would talk later. I nodded. That was fine. I had already said what needed to be said. When we rejoined the group, the tension didn't disappear. It shifted. People sensed that something had happened, even if they didn't know what. My father resumed hosting duties, louder now, more animated, overcompensating. As the evening moved toward the moment everyone had been waiting for, the speeches, the toasts, the formal acknowledgement, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Whatever happened next was no longer something I could control, but I had stopped hiding. And that, on its own, felt like a turning point. The speeches began the way they always did, predictable, polished. Carefully rehearsed words about success, perseverance, family pride. I watched faces around the room as people took turns praising my father, thanking him for guidance, for opportunities, for carrying the family forward. Each sentence stacked neatly on top of the last, building the image he'd spent his entire life protecting. My daughter stood beside me, swinging her legs slightly, bored but patient. She asked when the cake would be cut. I told her soon. I didn't know if that was true, but it felt important to keep things normal for her, to not let this moment turn into something sharp and frightening. Then my father stood. The room shifted instantly. He didn't need to ask for attention. He never had. Silence settled naturally, the way it does when people have been trained to listen. He thanked everyone for coming, talked about age, about reflection, about the importance of family. I noticed how carefully he chose his words, how often he used we instead of I. It was practiced humility. The kind that feels generous until you look closer. Then he started talking about legacy. He spoke about how families endure through generations, how names carry weight, how sacrifices made by one generation allow the next to rise higher. He talked about heirs without using the word directly, but everyone understood. This was the unspoken reason they were all here. Not to celebrate a birthday, but to witness continuity. I felt my chest tighten, not with fear, but with clarity. This was the moment he had designed the entire evening around. And suddenly, the decision I'd made days ago felt less like defiance and more like inevitability. My father's eyes moved through the room, pausing briefly on certain faces. People he deemed important, people who fit. He didn't look at my daughter. That omission was louder than anything he could have said. I took a breath and stepped forward before I could second-guess myself. The sound of my movement alone was enough to draw attention. Chairs creaked. Heads turned. My father stopped speaking, his expression carefully neutral. I didn't ask permission. I didn't raise my voice. I simply spoke. I said that before the night went any further, I wanted to introduce someone properly. I rested my hand on my daughter's shoulder. I said her name. I said she was my child. I said she was family. The room stayed silent, not hostile, just stunned. I said that I'd been thinking a lot about the word legacy lately and how differently people define it. I said some see it as bloodlines and names etched into documents. Others see it as values passed down quietly in kitchens and car rides and bedtime conversations. I said I used to think those definitions could coexist. My father's face had gone still. He wasn't angry. He was alert. The way someone looks when they realize a narrative is slipping out of their control. I said I received the invitation. I said I understood it perfectly. I did quote it. I didn't need to. The weight of it was already in the room. I said that being asked to leave my daughter behind wasn't just an exclusion. It was a lesson, one I refused to teach. My daughter looked up at me then, confused but trusting. I smiled down at her and told her she was doing nothing wrong, that she belonged everywhere I belonged, that no one else got to decide that for us. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Someone else cleared their throat. I felt eyes on me from every direction, but for the first time, they didn't feel heavy. They felt exposed. I said I wasn't there to argue or to disrespect my father on his birthday. I said I was there because silence had already done enough damage, and because pretending not to see something doesn't make it disappear. I said if legacy meant excluding people who didn't fit a narrow definition, then maybe it deserved to be questioned. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. I'd never seen him hesitate like that. Not in public, not ever. And then my daughter spoke, not loudly, not dramatically. She simply said she was happy to be there. She said she liked seeing everyone together. That was it. No accusation. No emotion beyond honesty. Something shifted then. I saw it ripple through the room. Adults uncomfortable with their own complicity. People forced to confront the contrast between a child's innocence and a grown man's rigidity. My father nodded once, stiffly. He said we would talk later, again, but the words sounded weaker this time, less certain. The speeches ended shortly after. Applause followed, but it felt hollow, like people were clapping out of habit, not celebration. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter now, more cautious. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was relief, like something heavy I'd been carrying without realizing it had finally been set down. I took my daughter's hand and walked away from the center of the room. Whatever happened next, after tonight, after this moment, would no longer be shaped by avoidance. We didn't leave immediately, not because I felt obligated to stay, but because I wanted my daughter to see that standing up for yourself doesn't always end in running away. We found a quiet corner near the back, away from the center of attention. Someone brought her a slice of cake. She ate it happily, completely unaware that the room around her was still recalibrating. The energy had changed. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't comfortable either. Conversations restarted in fragments. People spoke more softly, choosing words carefully, as if the wrong sentence might expose something they weren't ready to examine. A few relatives approached me quietly. One squeezed my arm and said nothing at all. Another told me I was brave. I didn't know how to respond to that. It hadn't felt brave. It had felt necessary. My father stayed busy, too busy. He moved from group to group, laughing louder than before, refilling glasses that didn't need refilling. He avoided looking in our direction, which told me more than any confrontation would have. This was how he handled loss of control, by pretending it hadn't happened. At one point, my aunt sat beside me. She glanced at my daughter, then back at me, and said she wished she'd had the courage to say something similar years ago. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. Families like ours collect unspoken regrets the way other people collect photographs. I watched my daughter interact with people who had barely acknowledged her before. Some were suddenly attentive, overcorrecting. Others remained distant, unsure of how to engage now that the rules had shifted. I let her navigate it on her own, stepping in only when she looked to me. She didn't seem hurt. That was the part that stayed with me. The harm had never been in her. It had always been in the way adults chose to see her. Eventually, my husband caught my eye and nodded toward the door. It was time. Not because we were unwelcome, but because the point had been made. We said our goodbyes politely. No dramatics, no final statements. I thanked my father for the invitation when we passed him. He nodded, his expression unreadable. He didn't say my name. The drive home was quieter than the drive there, not tense, just reflective. My daughter talked about the cake, the music, the way the house echoed. She asked if Grandpa was mad. I told her adults have feelings they don't always know how to handle. She accepted that answer easily. Children often do. That night after she was asleep, the weight of the day finally settled in. Not regret. Consequence. I knew this wasn't over. Moments like that don't resolve decades of behavior. They shift them, sometimes slowly, sometimes violently. The phone didn't ring the next day or the day after that. The silence was familiar, but it felt different now, less punishing, less powerful. I realized how much of my life had been shaped by the fear of this exact quiet and how little it actually took from me once I stopped chasing approval. When my father finally called, his voice was calm, controlled. He said we needed to talk. I told him we could, but not about whether my daughter belonged. That wasn't up for discussion anymore. There was a pause, a long one. I didn't rush to fill it. He said he felt blindsided. I said I had felt erased. He said it wasn't meant to be hurtful. I said intent didn't undo impact. We talked in circles for a while, the way people do when they're trying to protect an identity instead of a relationship. What struck me most was what he didn't say. He didn't apologize. Not really. He spoke about misunderstandings and expectations, about how things had always been done. He never spoke about my daughter as a person, only as a concept. That told me everything I needed to know. When the call ended, I felt strangely steady. Sad maybe, but not shaken. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and instead of falling apart, I felt more whole than I had in years. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects continued. Some family members grew closer. Others drifted away. Invitations changed. Conversations shifted. The hierarchy my father had spent a lifetime building no longer felt solid. It wasn't gone, but it was cracked. One evening, as I tucked my daughter into bed, she asked if she would still be invited to future family events. I told her yes. And if she wasn't, we'd make our own traditions. She smiled at that and said she liked that idea better anyway. Lying in bed later, I thought about the word heir and how narrow it suddenly felt. If legacy meant control, exclusion, and silence, then maybe it was never something worth inheriting in the first place. I didn't know what my relationship with my father would look like moving forward. But I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever ended with him would not end with my daughter. And that, more than any name or title, felt like a beginning. Time didn't fix everything. It rarely does. What it did was strip away the urgency, leaving behind something clearer and harder to ignore. The days after my father's birthday settled into a new rhythm, one that felt unfamiliar but oddly lighter. There were fewer calls, fewer obligatory check-ins, fewer moments where I found myself rehearsing answers in my head before speaking to him. At first, the absence felt strange. Then it felt peaceful. My daughter noticed the change before I named it. She asked why we weren't visiting Grandpa's house as often. I told her families change sometimes, and that space can be healthy. She accepted that explanation with the quiet wisdom children seem to have when adults finally stop lying to themselves. What surprised me most was how much energy I had been spending maintaining a version of myself that made other people comfortable. Without that pressure, small things began to shift. I laughed more easily. I spoke more directly. I stopped minimizing my own reactions. I didn't realize how practiced I'd become at shrinking until I stopped doing it. My father, meanwhile, tried to regain footing in subtle ways. A message here, a neutral comment there. No mention of the party, no mention of my daughter. It was as if acknowledging that moment might give it more power than he was willing to allow. That avoidance, once painful, now felt transparent. One afternoon, a package arrived at our door. No note, just a box addressed to my daughter. Inside was a book, an old one, clearly chosen with care. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an explanation. But it was the first time my father had reached out to her directly without filtering it through me or reducing it to obligation. I didn't know what to make of it. Progress, maybe, or an attempt at rewriting without confronting. I gave the book to my daughter without commentary. She hugged it to her chest and said she'd read it that night. She didn't ask why it came. She didn't need to. Children don't dissect intent the way adults do. They respond to what's in front of them. That evening, I realized something quietly important. My father's approval had always felt like the final missing piece, the thing that would somehow validate every choice I'd made. Standing on the other side of that moment, after the invitation, after the confrontation, I could see how hollow that belief had been. Approval from someone who measures worth so narrowly is never stable. It's always conditional. always temporary. I began thinking about legacy again, but differently this time. Not as something inherited, but as something modeled. My daughter had watched me choose her openly, publicly, without apology. That mattered more than any speech or confrontation ever could. It was a lesson she would carry long after the specifics of the night faded. Family gatherings became smaller, more intentional. Some relatives drifted away quietly, uncomfortable with the shift in dynamics. Others leaned in, relieved that someone had finally said what so many had only thought. I learned which relationships were built on proximity and which were built on respect. The difference was stark. Months later, my father and I finally sat down in the same room again. No audience, no ceremony, just two people navigating the aftermath of a long-held imbalance. He spoke about his upbringing, about expectations placed on him that he had never questioned. I listened, but I didn't excuse. Understanding doesn't require surrender. I told him plainly that my daughter would never be treated as an afterthought in my presence, that if he wanted a relationship with us, it would be built on acceptance, not tolerance. He didn't argue. He didn't agree outright either, but he listened. And for the first time, that felt like something. When we left, there were no promises, no dramatic reconciliations, just a fragile acknowledgement that things could not go back to the way they were. I was okay with that. Some bridges don't need to be fully rebuilt. They just need clearer boundaries. At home, life continued in its beautifully ordinary way. School projects, messy kitchens, laughter over small things, the kind of moments that never make it into speeches but somehow define everything that matters. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about that invitation. How a single line had forced years of unspoken truth into the open. How something meant to exclude had instead clarified what I was no longer willing to accept. My father wanted heirs. What he hadn't anticipated was that by drawing a line, he would finally push me to step fully into my own authority, not as his child, but as a parent. And once that shift happens, there's no going back. It took a while for me to admit that something had ended that night, even though nothing had officially been said. There was no announcement, no dramatic cutoff, no final argument. Just a quiet understanding that the version of my father I had spent my life negotiating with no longer had the same power over me. That realization came slowly, in ordinary moments, which somehow made it more real. I noticed it the first time I spoke to him without rehearsing my words beforehand. The anxiety that used to sit in my chest before every conversation was gone. I wasn't trying to earn anything anymore. I wasn't trying to prove that I was reasonable, respectful, or worthy of being taken seriously. I was just speaking, and if he didn't like what he heard, that discomfort belonged to him. My daughter, in her own way, sensed the shift too. She became more open around family, less cautious. She didn't look to me for reassurance as often, because she no longer felt the tension that had once hovered around certain names and places. Children adapt quickly when adults stop passing down fear. There were moments when guilt tried to creep back in. Late at night, I would wonder if I'd been too harsh, too public, too unyielding. That voice sounded a lot like my father's, I realized. It framed accountability as disrespect and boundaries as betrayal. Once I recognized it, the guilt lost its grip. What surprised me most was how little I missed the approval I'd chased for so long. I had imagined that letting go of it would feel like grief. Instead, it felt like relief. Like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. The constant calculation, what to say, what not to say, how to be just agreeable enough was gone. In its place was something quieter and steadier. My father, for his part, continued to exist in that space between denial and adjustment. Sometimes he tried to act as though nothing had changed, slipping into old patterns of conversation, old assumptions. Other times, he seemed almost cautious, as if unsure of where the boundaries now lay. I didn't correct him every time. I didn't need to. The boundaries weren't for him to approve of. They were for me to maintain. One afternoon, while sorting through old photos, I came across pictures from my childhood. Birthday parties, holidays, family gatherings. In almost every photo, I was smiling politely, standing just slightly apart. I had never noticed it before. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. I wasn't unhappy in those pictures. I was careful. That distinction mattered. I thought about how easily that carefulness could have been passed down to my daughter. How close I had come to teaching her that love required self-erasure. That realization unsettled me more than any argument ever could have. It confirmed that speaking up hadn't just been about that one invitation. It had been about breaking a cycle that thrived on silence. There was no single moment of closure with my father. no heartfelt apology, no emotional breakthrough. And eventually, I understood that waiting for one would have put me right back where I started, placing my sense of resolution in his hands. Closure, I learned, doesn't always come from the person who caused the wound. Sometimes it comes from choosing not to reopen it. As months passed, our interactions found a new, quieter rhythm. Fewer expectations, clearer limits. I no longer filled the space with explanations or justifications. If something didn't work for my family, I said so plainly. If my daughter wasn't included, we declined without apology. The world didn't collapse. No one disowned anyone. Life simply adjusted around the truth. One evening, as I helped my daughter with a school project about family history, she asked what legacy meant. I paused, thinking about how I might have answered that question a year earlier. Then I told her the truth. I said legacy is what people learn from how you treat them. It's what stays when titles, money, and expectations fall away. She nodded thoughtfully and went back to her work, satisfied. Watching her, I felt something settle firmly into place. Whatever my father believed, whatever traditions he clung to, they no longer defined us. My daughter would grow up knowing she belonged without condition, that her value wasn't something to be negotiated or earned through compliance. I realized then that what had truly ended wasn't my relationship with my father. It was my willingness to participate in a system that diminished my child. That ending didn't require his agreement. It required mine. And once that decision was made, everything else became simpler. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves as turning points until much later. They pass quietly, almost unremarkable on the surface, but when you look back, you realize everything began to move in a different direction because of them. My father's birthday was one of those moments. Not because of what was said aloud, but because of what I finally stopped accepting. The weeks turned into months, and the sharpness of that night softened into something more reflective. Not distant, not erased, just integrated. It became part of our story, not the center of it. My daughter grew, as children do, quickly and without ceremony. New interests, new questions, new confidence. She carried none of the shame that had been projected onto her, and that felt like the greatest victory of all. My relationship with my father settled into a version that was quieter and more honest than anything we'd had before. It wasn't warm in the way people like to imagine reconciliation, but it was real. There were boundaries now, clearly defined and rarely tested. He learned slowly that access to us came with respect, not conditions. Whether he fully understood that shift or simply adapted to it didn't matter as much as the outcome. I stopped thinking about inheritance altogether. Money, property, names, those things lost their weight once I realized how easily they can be used as leverage. What mattered was what I was passing on daily without speeches or announcements. The way I listened, the way I spoke up, the way I showed my daughter that love doesn't come with footnotes. Sometimes, I wondered if my father ever regretted the wording of that invitation. If in a quiet moment, he replayed the evening and considered how differently things might have unfolded. I'll probably never know. And surprisingly, I no longer feel the need to. What I do know is this: exclusion has a way of backfiring. What was meant to diminish instead clarified. What was meant to control instead freed. By drawing such a stark line, my father forced me to choose, and in doing so, gave me the opportunity to choose correctly. My daughter doesn't remember the details of that night. She remembers the cake, the music, the way I held her hand. That's enough. The rest is my responsibility to carry, to process, and to learn from. If there's a legacy I care about now, it's not one that lives on paper or in family trees. It's the kind that shows up in how safe a child feels asking questions, in how confidently she takes up space, in how she understands her worth without needing permission. The invitation said heirs only, no dead ends. What it didn't realize was that endings and beginnings often look the same from the outside. My father wanted a future he could control. What I chose instead was a future that could grow.